So a bit of a disclaimer, my suggestions are incomplete, so don't leave here after and say Knights didn't talk about this or didn't talk about that. First of all, they are concepts rather than specifics that I'm going to suggest. The idea is to really generate discussion, so I hope we can do that after. The sources of information, I'm going to use some information from FAO, some information from the GAP report, and if you're not familiar with the GAP report, I think especially the students, you should go. Every year they have a publication. It's released at the World, what is called World Food Fair that's held in October in Des Moines, Iowa, and that's something that is a must read, I think. And then we are going to talk a bit about some of the studies that my lab have conducted at various institutions. So, projected population growth. I think most of us in agriculture are familiar with the fact that the world population is going to grow significantly. So it's projected to grow from 7.3 billion currently to about 9.7 billion in 2050. So that means the demand for food is going to grow up, and it means that there is going to be increasing pressure for us to produce our own food. So the great challenge is to essentially to double global agriculture output by 2050, and to do so in face of limited and in some cases diminishing resources. Okay, so we have to, in other words, produce more, potentially with the same amount of resources or with even less resources. So the next question is why protein, and more specifically, why animal protein? Well, this is not a change that is going to occur in the population. Currently, about 50% of our population could be considered middle class with relatively high income. In the next 20, 30 years, that number is going to jump from 50% to nearly 70%. So in developing countries, you're going to have a growing middle class. What we have observed is that as persons' income increase, there's an increased demand for animal protein. People move their consumption, shift their consumption away from plant protein towards animal protein. So, is this pointer, can you see that? Okay, so maybe I can step away a bit from the mic. So in the next 5 to 6 years, we expect to see an increase in demand for milk by about 12%, an increase in demand for meat for about 24%, increased demand for poultry by about 28%. And that is just between 2013 and 2022. This very busy slide, again produced by the GAP report, sort of summarizes the challenges that we are going to face. So first off, we have this growing population from 7.1 billion to 9.6 billion. We are also faced with the fact that we are going to have a continued rural to urban migration, and we are going to have a situation where a large percentage of the population is going to be middle income, more money, okay? More persons, more money, more food. And specifically, there's going to be an increase in demand for animal protein. So it's projected by 2030, there's going to be a 63% increase for poultry, a 55% increase for milk, and a 44% increase for ruminant meat, okay? At the same time, if we continue the same approaches to production, it would mean that we need increased land space as well as increased utilization of the water that we extract. Both land and water is going to be limiting. Okay, so the approach that we need to take in order to meet that growing demand is going to be different to what we have done in the past. So what are some of the approaches that one can take to meet this demand? The first approach we can take is expansion. And I've just put on a graph that we talk about a bit later to show what I mean by expansion. Expansion simply means that to increase production, we need to either get more land or we need to have more animals. Okay, so for increased production, more inputs, specifically land or animals. We can also try to meet this demand by intensification. And with intensification, it means we are putting more resources or more inputs per unit of land or more inputs per unit of animal. Okay? In this case, this figure demonstrates this. We have a situation where the amount of nitrogen that is utilized on a given area of land has increased. Okay? The actual area harvested have remained the same. So, and we, as a result of that increase amount use of nitrogen on the same, more or less the same amount of land, we are able to get some increase in production. So we have intensified the production system, not increased, so there's no expansion, but just we are putting more resources on the same sort of fixed unit. The other approach to meet this demand is what we refer to as total factor productivity. And essentially it means producing more with the same amount of resources or even with less resources. So we want to try to increase output and keep the inputs constant. And this perhaps is more or less the most sustainable, or perhaps the only sustainable approach to meet our growing demand for protein. I want to spend some time to talk about this productivity and the differences in how high and low income countries have attempted to meet their demand for protein. So this slide again comes from the GAP report, and it looks at the growth in agriculture output over time. So we're looking from 1961 to 2012, right? And what is the source of this growth? So in green, it's total factor productivity, meaning efficiency. In sort of this orange color, it's inputs per unit of land, so that's sort of your more intensification. Here, this color is for land expansion, and the blue is irrigation. So in high-income countries, initially, so first of all, the rate of growth has been around 2% consistently, 2% per year. In the 1960s to 70s, the expansion or the increase in agriculture output was due to an increase in total factor productivity, land expansion, as well as intensification. But as we move forward in time and into the sort of last decade or so, we see that most of the productivity, increase in agriculture output, has been due to increase in productivity. And in fact, in high-income countries, they have reduced the amount of land that they are utilizing for production, and they have utilized the amount of inputs per unit of land or inputs per animal. So in high-income countries, the point I want to make, in high-income countries, the growth in agriculture productivity has been driven by increase in productivity or efficiency. If we look at low-income countries, contrast that to low-income countries, we see that we are doing, in a sense, okay in terms of overall agriculture output, or the rate of increase in agriculture output. So it's currently up to about 4% per year. But that increase in agriculture output is driven both by expansion in land, right? Increased intensification, increased water use, and some increase also in productivity, okay? This is good. However, the increased demand for land, increased demand or utilization of inputs is perhaps not sustainable. I want to point out how this increase in productivity might actually look in different agriculture sectors. And I'm going to use the US as an example. So this is productivity, Productivity, where were we? In the case of the US dairy industry. And in the case of the US dairy industry, what we can see is that since 1987, the size of the dairy herd have declined from about 10.4 million head down to about 9.2 million head. Right? So contraction of the number of animals. However, if we look at output, milk production has risen from about 140 billion pounds up to over 200 billion pounds. So at the same time, animal numbers have declined, they have been able to increase total milk production. Let's look at some further trends in milk production, and try to explain why this has occurred. So again, in red is the number of cows in millions, so we can see that decline, right? In blue is milk per cow, we talk about that. Let's look at green, supply. So in green, the supply has risen, animal numbers have declined, but the reason why this is occurring is output. Milk per cow in blue have continued to increase. It used to be that they were getting 5,000-6,000 pounds per year per animal. Now they are up to about 22,000 pounds of milk per cow. Right? So again, increase in productivity. Let's look at another sector. This is the broiler sector. And, perhaps we are somewhat more akin to this I think in developing countries. In the broiler sector, we've seen that the weight of a bird, the slaughter weight of a bird, increased from just under 3 pounds to currently somewhere around 6 pounds. So we are getting larger birds. We are harvesting larger birds. We also see that mortality rates back in the 1920s was as high as 18%, but now mortality is down to about 4%. And key to this is the feed conversion ratio, the amount of feed per pound of gain. That declined from it used to take about 5 pounds of feed to get 1 pound of gain, and now it's down to under 2 pounds of feed per pound of gain. Again, improvement in efficiency. We could look at the beef industry, and again what we saw, significant decline in cow numbers, significant increase in beef output. The pork industry, similar trend, decline in the number of animals. This is the size of the breeding herd per quarter, and this is the total output of pork. So they have been able to produce more with less. I want to stay with the pork industry for a bit of time and try to delve into why that have occurred, because that provides some sort of insight into some of the things that we need to address, not only in the swine industry, but in the sheep and goat industry and the dairy industry. So why have they increased their productivity? Or maybe perhaps we can look at different measures of productivity in the swine, US swine industry. If we look at pigs per litter, number of piglets born per litter, they moved from 7.4 in 1981 to 10.2. If they look at the number of litters that a sow is producing per year, moved from 1.5 to 1.9. The number of pigs marketed per sow per year almost doubled, right, from 10 to 18. The amount of pork produced per sow per year went from close to 2,000 pounds to over 4,000 pounds. Right? Live weight of the animals have increased, so the live weight of the animals they're slaughtering is close to 270. It has gone up probably closer to 300 pounds now. The dressing percentage, so you're getting a larger animal, but it's not because of a whole lot of fat, more fat. They're actually getting good, solid meat. The dressing percentage have moved from 71% to 75%. The dressing weight is up to 207 pounds, and the retail meat is up to 161 pounds from 134 pounds. So what you see is there have been improvement in all the sort of measures of efficiency or productivity. So what is the net effect of increasing productivity. If we improve productivity, it means we can have a situation like this, where the amount of land that we are farming can remain relatively constant, right? We can, in some cases, reduce the number of farms, okay, because we can free up labor to do, quote unquote, perhaps more productive, more high income jobs. And what we see is that associated with this was increase in productivity. More importantly, to the ordinary citizen, as we increase productivity of agriculture output, the proportion of their disposable income spent on food declines. So in the green bars is the total amount of money that is the economy spends on food, and that has risen. Of course, people have more money, there's more people, so the total amount of money that is spent on food has risen. But the proportion of a person's income that they are spending on food has gone down from about 20% to close to 5%. Okay? So back in 1925 or so, they were spending 20% of their disposable income on food. Now the average American spends less than 5% of their disposable income on food. So we have talked about high-income countries, using the US as an example. Let's look at small island developing states, which is more like the situation we would encounter. And how has productivity changed? This is milk production in small island developing states for the period 1964 to 2014. And what we see in blue is the total milk producing animals, and sort of in this orange color, total milk production. So milk production has sort of moved around, but it has increased. The trend is upwards. But that increase in milk production has been associated with an increase in the number of animals, different to what we see in high-income countries. If we look at pork production, same trend. We have been able to increase output, but that increase in pork production has been associated with increase in the size of the herd, the number of animals. And sheep and goat, which is dear to a lot of us, same trend. We're doing a good job. Yes, we're increasing output in sheep and goat meat. But again, it's due to increases in the number of animals, not increases in productivity. Let's look at Trinidad and Tobago specifically. Okay? This is milk production, and I know there are a number of people involved in the milk industry, and Sue and other people might be able to correct me, but this is the FAO statistics. We have milk production in blue, total milk production, and what we see since 1964, it went up for a while until the 1970s, then declined. If we looked at animals, we see that animals' numbers have increased up to about 2,000 and then have been declining somewhat, right? But yield, which is a measure, right, kilogram per animal, what we see is that have continuously declined. So our productivity in the dairy sector have declined as opposed to what we have observed in high-income countries. What about the pork industry? The pork industry more or less has the same sort of pattern, right, where output is really paralleling the number of animals. So output increase, and that increase is going to be associated with increase in number of animals. Output decrease because there have been a decrease in number of animals. Except more recently we have been able to see a decline in the number of pigs slaughtered, and yet output is increasing. Whether that increase is due to changes in actual productivity in terms of improved reproductive performance, growth rate, or is it due simply to increased slaughter weights, I am not too sure. But this is the sort of relationship we would like to see in other livestock sectors. Okay. Sheep and goat meat, again, same relationship between output and the number of animals. So, in summary, at least for this part of the talk, okay, in summary, the agriculture and livestock output in developing countries ranges from about 2 to 4%. So there's some, hope. We are trying to meet that demand that we would have in 2050. However, the sources of that increase in output varies between high-income and low-income countries. In high-income countries, the increase in output is due to productivity, whereas in low-income countries, the expansion has mainly been due to, or increase in output has mainly been due to expansion and intensification. Okay. I want to move into the next component of my presentation and really try to share a few thoughts on research that I think is needed in order to improve efficiency. All right? And again, these are just a few thoughts. Initially, for a presentation like this, I would like to be able to talk about all the new technology. So I would like to talk about the amazing work that biotechnology, Dr. Ramlachan and in her field is doing to improve corn. So where we can have high protein corn, or we can have soybean meal that has low phytate levels. Or perhaps we can talk about hydroponically produced forages. Or we can talk, we would talk a bit about genomic evaluation of animals. We can talk about perhaps cloning and things like that. All of those things are really good, and they sound, as my my PhD mentor uses, he uses the term sexy. All of these technology is pretty sexy, and that is what we want to get into. But we really have to ask the question, is that what we need? Can we jump ahead to these technologies, or are there questions, basic questions, that we still need to answer? And I would like to suggest that there are some basic questions that we have not yet answered, despite 50, 60 years of research in Trinidad and Tobago. So, why the need for our own research? Couple pointers. First of all, those countries that are doing this high-tech research, their focus is not on us. Working in an institution in the US, I don't think there's anyone in my college that has a significant focus on research towards developing countries. Now, there are some programs that do, but not in my college. They're focused on trying to increase productivity and profitability of operations in the US. Secondly, so the other thought is, well, they can develop the technology and we can utilize it. No, the research is not always directly applicable. And we sometimes have to tweak it, or as I would suggest in some cases, we have to develop our own sort of research and apply our own techniques. The third thing I want to just remind you of is that research needs to have impact. As a student, and many of you guys who are students here might hear the same thing, I would suggest something to one of my lecturers and they would say, this has been done already. And if you say, well, where is it? You cannot find it. So for research to be impactful, I think it needs to be published. Whether it's not in a scientific journal or whether it is in some type of magazine, it needs to be published. It needs to be distributed for it to be impactful. Okay? The research, and I think especially for the University of Trinidad and Tobago, the research that is generated need to be economically, environmentally, socially, as well as biologically sustainable. Okay? We cannot just produce or do research for the sake of doing it. Not in these, I think, sort of more trying times, not in the sort of economic situation we are in. The third point, for the research to have impact, it must be translated. All right? Those of you who are familiar with the whole concept of DNA being transcribed and then replicated, transcribed, and then translated into protein, well, that research needs to move from the researcher. The extension agents need to appreciate and understand that, and then that needs to go into the production system where it's going to have an impact. So I have a basic list. The list was about twice this size, but I sort of trimmed it down to a few points. I think if we are focusing on increasing animal productivity, we need to determine and develop, quote unquote, the best animals. I think we need to feed them properly. I think we need to put in place appropriate systems for reproduction, for health management, and general management systems. And I think we also need to develop approaches to reduce wastage and add value to those products if the system is going to be sustainable. So when we talk about determining or developing the best animal for our production system, I think there are a range of questions. Again, very basic questions. The species, breed or type, what traits do we emphasize, what approaches to selection should we use, and how eventually do we evaluate what is the best animal. So here's a good research question for some of you, the students, undergraduate students. If we are talking about milk production, what is the best animal for us? Should our milk production be based on the dairy cow? Should it be based on water buffaloes? Should it be based on goats or sheep? What is the best animal? And the other thing we need to determine is how would we actually know? What is the variable that we would measure in order to tell us that this animal is the best for us? Very simple question, but very difficult to answer. It means we need to look at the animal that can perform the best under our condition. Do we have the other resources that go with managing that animal? And at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars and cents per unit of output. Okay? Again, are we using the right species? Should we be producing more rabbits? Should we focus on poultry? We're doing good. We have great biological efficiencies in the poultry sector. But of course, everything in the broiler sector is practically imported. Is that what we want to base our meat and protein supply on? All right? Or should we go to the neotropical species, as Dr. Garcia would suggest? So some of the questions we need to answer in trying to come up with the best animal or the best species, we need to determine whether or not there's a market for it. What is the biological efficiency, in particular feed conversion ratio and things like that? Is it economically feasible? All right? Does it make sense? Because if it doesn't make dollars and cents, then it doesn't make sense. Okay? Is it environmentally sustainable? Having decided on a species, we have to make decisions about the breeds and types. We have about 50 years of doing selection in the ministry and privately. Have we made a decision on which animal or which breed of animal performs the best for us? Should it be based on the sort of temperate breeds? Is Jamaica hope the animal that we think it is? Or do we need to go further apart and look for different types of genetics? That is critical. Same thing with dairy goats. We are all familiar with these goat breeds. The Saanen and the Alpine and the Toggenburg. But here's a list of goats, registered goats in India, many of which we would have never heard of, but many of which could probably perform better under our conditions. Okay? So those things need to be evaluated as well. we have tried to make the case. When I sort of pulled this out, I didn't realize it's going on 20 years. So 20 years ago, we were trying to make the case that our milk production system maybe should be shifted away from large ruminant animals to small ruminant animals. So we talked and we wrote on the status and potential of dairy goats in the tropics. Okay. Some time ago, we also tried to evaluate, myself and then subsequently Mr. Ramgati, looked at trying to evaluate and compare crossbred Holstein animals to Jamaica Hope in order to get a feel of what is the better animal for production in our environment. The next question is, are we selecting the right animals? Again, 50 years of the Artificial Breeding Center. What are the traits we are focusing on? Have we made improvement? Have milk production gone up? Have fertility improved? Because we are selecting animals, we are bringing genetics at some significant cost into the country. And we need to have this decision. Should we be focusing on production traits, fertility traits, right? Should we focus on beef traits? Yes, beef traits in our dairy animals because we have bull calves and stuff like that that go into market. Should we focus on maintenance and longevity? How much focus should we put on these different areas? Should our focus be more on production, or should it be more on fertility and sort of longevity or maintenance? Again, Canadian dairy industry, whole range of traits. What are we focusing on, and what should we be focusing on? For those of you in the small ruminant industry, there are a range of traits now that we can look at. We can look at growth traits, reproduction traits, well, not for us world traits, but certainly parasite resistance. We have to design the animal, come up with a description of the animal that is best for our production system, that animal that is going to produce efficiently. This is just a figure that shows you now in the sheep and goat industry where you can get some information. So if you're in the US, you can simply go to a website and you can determine which particular trait you want to improve. Weaning weight, number of lamb-borns, reproduction, parasite resistance, and you can sort this data and you can see the animals that are the trait leaders, the genetic trait leaders in the case for sheep or for goats or for cattle. And then you can make your selection based on that. Is this something that we need to do? Can we get to that point? What approaches are we taking to selection? Are we still going to a producer, to a farm, simply looking at the animal, making some judgment about its physical features and selecting on that basis? Are we using somewhat more high-tech, and this is what we refer to as a grow-safe system, where we can actually measure the actual intake of the animal, exactly how much food that animal consumed over some period of time, so we can better measure feed conversion efficiency? Or are we using sort of things like to measure carcass traits such as ultrasonography? These are all improvements over just a sort of objective measure. But clearly, this is not sufficient, because traits like growth and maybe carcass characteristics, while they have high heritability and the phenotype is a very good reflection of the genotype of the animal, there are a number of relevant traits in which the phenotype is not a reflection of the genotype. In other words, traits with low heritability, including reproduction traits, longevity traits, they have low heritability, and simply looking at the animal performance does not give us an indication of the genetic value of the animal. More recently, industries are moving to what is referred to as genomic expected breeding values. Today, this technology allows us to take a reference population a population of animal, let's say that is fantastic for milk production. We can scan the genome of that animal, determine, almost like a formula, the combinations of genes or polymorphisms that are associated with high milk production. We can develop formulas based on this, and then at a very young age, we can then take a blood sample from an animal, determine its genetic makeup, and whether or not it's likely to be a high-producing animal or not. Okay? This is very good technology, and it has driven selection, improvement in animal performance up significantly. However, the animals that are produced this way, while they are great, they are not great for us, because these would be animals, these reference animals are for particular traits in a particular environment. Okay? Not necessarily the animals we would want. It means to say that we can use this technology, but we have to do it on our own animals. The importance of genetic improvement, if you just beg my indulgence to just stay on this topic a bit. Why is it important? Here's a situation in the beef industry. In the beef industry, the idea is to get animals to produce more weight, to grow faster, to be bigger. However, growth rate, or in this case what we're using is yearling weight in orange, that trait is correlated with birth weight, and they're antagonistic. So generally, as your yearling weight, as the animal gets bigger, they tend to be coming from animals that have larger birth weights. What does that mean? Larger birth weights would mean that there's a potential for difficult birth or dystocia. So using genetic evaluations over time, they have been able to keep birth weight constant while increasing yearling weight. What this chart is saying is that bulls, back in the birth weight of calves sired by bulls in 1972, the birth weight is similar to that of calves sired by bulls in 2014. However, calves sired by bulls in 2014 produce about 100 pounds more than calves sired by bulls back in 1972. Okay? The importance of genetics. And we can see the same thing in the sheep industry. Just over the last 10 years or so, due to genetics, specifically due to genetics, they have been able to increase the amount of lamb or the pounds of lamb weaned per ewe, up to about 12 pounds. So, that is genetics. The other question is feed, and I sort of hit this very quickly. To feed animal properly, we need to know the actual requirements. More or less, Mr. Andel and perhaps Dr. Mohammed, what we would be using are feeding standards developed by North America or maybe by France. And we need to realize, very important to realize, that those feeding standards are not determined for the animals we might be using, for the animals under our conditions, or for the feeds we might use. And so those feeding standards need to be adjusted. That is research that only we can do. No one else is going to come and do that research for us. We need to develop and grow and evaluate the right feed stuff. And we need to process and store that feed. So, if you take the case of the US, soybean and corn is the standard diet, the base diet for their livestock production system. Their animals get more or less, for perhaps 3/4 of their life, they're probably going to get a feed that contains some amount of soy and some amount of corn. And so they have tried to improve that particular feed source. So they have, for example, in soybean, they have modified the soybean so that it may be herbicide resistant, so that they can spray over the soybean and not damage the plants. Pest and disease tolerant. They're trying to develop varieties that are drought and tolerant and tolerant to saline conditions. They are trying to improve the amino acid profile. Dr. Bridgemohan spoke about that. And removal of some of the non-nutritional factors, some of the factors that tend to reduce digestibility or reduce performance, particularly in young animals. So they have found a crop that they can grow, and then they are modifying the crop to meet their needs. Do we have one that can grow in our condition? And can we improve that crop? We have, again, for the better of 3, perhaps 4 decades, have invested a significant amount of money on sugarcane and sugarcane feeding. There still remains a lot of work to do. But today we have newer tools. We have the tools that Dr. Ramlachan utilizes, and so we can ask ourselves, is there an opportunity to improve the protein content of sugarcane? Can we modify sugarcane so that the silages made from sugarcane can maintain its energy content rather than see that drop in energy content in the silages? All right? How can we improve processing of these feeds? Can we utilize other types of crops, as Dr. Bridgemohan spoke about? There are a number of I put this slide up there to really just point out that there are other countries in similar situations in Africa, Asia, and they're making the step forward. So they're looking at different genotypes of Bracharia, right, to find out, is there a type that is best suited for their environment? Can we do that? We also need to look at the economics of growing, harvesting, and storing feeds. Producers are very comfortable in going to national flour mills and buying, quote unquote, a bag of feed. But it's much more difficult to convince them that forage is a crop. And we need to do more work at that, encouraging our producers to grow forage. But to do that, we need to demonstrate the economics of growing of it, how it can be harvested and how it can be stored. And there are a number of projects, small-scale projects targeting small-scale producers aimed at helping them to better grow and store their forage resources. Okay? Can we improve the utilization of the biomass? Again, for years we have been talking about the importance of cassava as a staple in our diet, right? But the conversations have gone on, is it cost effective? Can we replace a portion of wheat flour with cassava flour? What would that do to the price of flour? Well, here is an opportunity where we can increase the value of the product. So the product would no longer be just the root, but it can be the leaves, it can be the peelings. In such a way, we can perhaps improve the economic feasibility of utilizing cassava and cassava flour. So we need to look at different options. For years I've said that the leaves of cassava is one of the is a very high protein forage, but I'm not too sure how many people actually are feeding cassava. I remember when I was young, we actually had a goat called Cassava because each time it got away, it went through the cassava field and cleaned it out. Now I understand why that goat would like cassava. It's 24% crude protein. Okay. Of course, UTT really took I thought, is a very good decision in terms of looking at single cell protein. We have the natural gas, then methane or natural gas can be utilized in producing microbes, right, that can then go into our feed source. What is nice about this project? Well, there are several things that are nice. It's because we are utilizing microbes. We can genetically modify those microbes to ensure they have the sort of amino acid profile, a good complement of essential amino acids. And then we can grow these bacteria using our natural gas and methane and make that an important source of feed. Reproductive efficiency. It's not because I'm a reproductive physiologist, but reproductive efficiency and reproductive performance is critical, right? It has the single largest impact on production and productivity in many of our livestock species. We saw the example in the case of the swine industry. Most of those things were brought about by improvements in reproductive efficiency. So, some research questions for reproductive physiologists such as Mr. Ramgati, Mr. Su, and others. What are the exact values in terms of reproductive performance? How are our cows really doing? How are our goats and sheep performing? What's the reproductive performance in rabbits? What are the specific points that are limiting? Is it estrus response? Is it conception rate? Is it embryonic mortality? Where do we have problems? And can we use reproductive management techniques to improve reproductive performance? So we have attempted to do this. I think at studies here at UE and UTT. So for example, we looked at the effect of timed artificial insemination on pregnancy rates in dairy cattle. One of the problems with dairy cattle is that we cannot get them pregnant fast enough. Okay, so we have too many open cows. The milk production is declining, but we cannot get them back pregnant in order to have a next lactation. The reason we can't get them pregnant is in part due to the fact that we cannot detect them in heat efficiently, cannot detect the signs of estrus. What some producers have moved back to, which I think is a retrograde step, is the use of bulls. And even so, sometimes reproductive performance is not great. So by using reproductive management techniques such as timed artificial insemination, where we treat the animals, where we actually take control of the reproductive system of the animal, we can then determine when is the optimum time for insemination and is that we can increase pregnancy rates from around 10 to 12% to about 40% using timed artificial insemination. If you read the literature, what you would see is that 40% pregnancy rate is comparable with what they are getting in dairy animals in Europe and in North America using this technique. So we are able right away to almost quadruple the pregnancy rate and get it up to standards that would be considered acceptable. We were able to use the same procedure in water buffaloes, and we got rates varying from 25 to 40%, but as a researcher, of course, I'm gonna highlight the more impressive number, up to about 40%. But we really before did not know what is the true pregnancy rate to artificial insemination in water buffaloes. We use timed artificial insemination again to reduce the age at first calving. Okay, so when we looked at the data, we looked at data at the university fields, UE field station and at ECIAF, the average age at first calving was in excess of 30 months. And we utilized animals that was much younger and did timed artificial insemination, was able to reduce the age at first calving. Again, all of these things contribute to improvements in production efficiency. Finally, not finally, but in terms of discussing reproduction, I want to just highlight some of the work by Mr. Ramgati, where we took the other approach and we simply said, well, if reproduction is a problem, can we induce those animals to produce milk without getting them pregnant? Okay, so that is referred to as lactation induction. And so we took what is referred to as essentially virgin heifers, and we treated them with a combination of hormones. And after about 21 days, we were able to get increase in milk production, and this milk production was maintained. We took the measurements up to about 10 weeks, Half of these animals, we did mammary stimulation, half we did not. And we saw that not only could we induce lactation in virgin heifers, animals that were never bred, but we are able to maintain that milk production over a period of time. What we didn't show here is that there's no effect on subsequent reproduction, so we can go ahead and breed those animals as well if we want. Animal health and disease research questions. Again, there's very high-tech questions you could be asking. But I would like to know what are true mortality and morbidity rates. What's the mortality and morbidity rates for lambs and for kids in Trinidad and Tobago? When are they dying? Why are they dying? Does it make sense to vaccinate or, for example, give certain supplements? What is the situation with anti-helminthic resistance, especially if you're into sheep and goats? Is it as big a problem as we see in the southern United States? All right, basic questions that I think could form the basis for research projects. Okay. Are we using optimum management systems? Again, research with myself and Mr. Su and Ramgati, we looked at different weaning systems. And all I would say about this is that previously, when we looked at the literature suggested that we needed to wean those lambs off their mothers in order to get them rebred, so we can go after that 3 lambings in 2 years or a lambing interval of 240 days. And so we decided to investigate this, and we looked at animals that were either early weaned or animals that were not weaned, right, in 2 different experiments. And what we found, right, in these 2 different experiments, that the lambing intervals were the same, and more specifically, the proportion of used lambing was the same. So whether we weaned the lambs off or we didn't wean the lambs off, it didn't make a difference. What we did see a difference in, again, in 2 experiments, in the first one, we saw that if we weaned those animals early, the mortality rate was much higher than if we weaned them late. And then the other thing we saw in the second experiment, based on this information, our early weaning went a little bit later, of course, because we didn't want 22% of our lambs dying. But what we are able to still see is that by weaning those animals later, we were able to get more total gain. We were able to get a faster growth rate. So the average daily gain went from about 98 grams per day to 124 grams per day. And the total weight gain went from about 8.4 kilograms to 10.6. No difference in mortality in this second trial, simply because the actual age at weaning went up to 108 days as opposed to about 75 days in our first experiment. So simple management changes can have a significant impact on the productivity of the livestock operation. Okay. Are we using the most optimum management system? Today in the US, there's a big debate. It's very difficult to get animals pregnant, for example, in the summer months. So a lot of the dairies are asking the question, should we go to a seasonal dairy operation? Okay? I think we need to ask ourselves the same question, but not for so much the heat, because it's going to be hot year-round, but in terms of the availability of nutrients. I think as basic as Mr. Andel and Mr. Su would tell their students, is that in ruminant livestock production systems, we need to attempt to match the peak in nutrient demand with the peak availability of nutrients. Okay? So, put another way, does it make sense that a cow, you had cows calving a month ago, to be in peak milk production at this time in the year when there's no forage around? Or should we manipulate our manipulate our production system in such a way that when those animals have their highest demand for nutrients, when they're in lactating, and particularly when they're in peak lactation, that this coincides with the period of greatest biomass availability? And the other question we have is there a role for reproductive management techniques in trying to utilize such a production system? Seasonal farrowing. Of course, we know, a lot of the small pig producers, their time when they can actually make some money is to sell pork for Christmas. So should we be encouraging our producers? I think they already know this, but can we assist them in orienting their production systems in such a way that they are able to maximize their production to a time when the prices are going to be highest? Okay? That can encourage more producers to potentially get into the market because of the economics in it. Once you have answered some of these questions, of course there are always questions to be answered, then we can translate it and we can develop management systems. We can publish these management systems, make them available to producers so that they can then go on and implement it to increase their productivity. Another question that we should be asking ourselves is, what can we do to the primary product? We need to potentially add value to the primary product. That increase in value can drive increases in consumption. Maybe perhaps it's more convenient to the person to purchase, so that would increase consumption. Maybe we can increase quality. We see it all the time, right? Vitamin, A or D added to the milk, something like that. Or we can try to, although this one goes back to more the production, but we now see omega-3 enhanced eggs and things like that. So we can sort of adding value to the product, right? So if we can add value, we can increase consumption, we can increase quality of the product, potentially increase demand, get higher prices, and as such, producers would be more willing to invest in opportunities to improve productivity. A big thing in terms of dealing with the primary product, addressing problems with the primary product, is to reduce losses. It's estimated that one-third of the primary products that is produced is lost, is wasted. So if we are going to address this demand for increased food, then one of the things we also need to do is to reduce loss. I want to point out the fact that what I sort of just did is relatively easy. Okay? So we can identify potential areas to increase total factor productivity or to approaches to increase productivity. That's the easy thing, just thinking about these things. Actually implementing it is somewhat more difficult. And I'll show a couple of examples. Yes, I showed all these great things about what is going on in US agriculture, but it doesn't occur in isolation. It comes at a cost. What this figure shows is that the US invests close to $14 billion a year in research and development in agriculture. So when governments or institutions and things say, we want to do something in agriculture, we want to increase production, we want to increase productivity, it must come with the understanding that there's going to be a need for significant investment, okay? Both by the private sector and public sector, okay? So in some cases, for example, more recently, public sector investment in research and development in agriculture has outpaced public sector. So private sector, public sector. And in fact, public sector investment has declined over the last couple of Congress in the US, and it makes getting grant dollars a whole lot more difficult. But still, total of about $14 billion per year. I also want to point out that there are industries in the US that have not followed the general trend or general approach. And one such industry is the sheep industry, okay? So the sheep industry is a good example of the failure to develop and adopt new approaches, newer technologies. And what has occurred? Well, in the sheep industry, what you see is, this is production, commercial lamb production in orange. That has been on decline. And it has been associated with this, has been a decline in animal inventory. If this was the cattle situation, this line would have been going in the opposite direction, right? But in the sheep industry, we have seen a contraction in the number of animals, and we have seen a contraction in production. And the reason why the US industry continues to struggle is that there's been no improvement in productivity. In green is a variable referred to as lambing rate, the number of lambs born per 100 ewes exposed to rams, etc. So it's a sort of global measure of productivity of the ewe flock. And if you notice, since 1987, it has remained somewhere between 100 to 110. Compare that to the UK, which can range 150 to 200, same thing in Canada, right? So the US, in terms of productivity in the sheep sector, it's really bad. So we have took this on and to show you some of the simple things that you can do to have a positive impact on our industry. So I'll just point out a few studies aimed at increasing lifetime productivity of the ewe. It's a simple process. I don't mean to be crude, but what the producers say and what we have come up with is that if you want to increase lifetime productivity, right, just as we saw with the swine industry with pigs, what you have to do is breed the females early, breed them often, get them to make an optimum number of young, and keep the young alive. And that's what we have attempted to do to address it with research in sheep. So we have one of the limitations in getting animals to breed more frequently in the US, so sheep and goats, is that they are seasonal. So we have conducted studies where we have tried to address this and break that seasonal pattern of reproduction. Not only in the dry ewes, or ewes that are not lactating, but also in the lactating ewes, because remember, we don't want to wean them early because we see that decrease in performance. So we have addressed those topics. The other thing is to get them to breed relatively early. So myself and Adam Redhead, some of you all may know him, we have conducted studies, again, where we are looking at different treatments with different gonadotropins, different hormones, or a combination of hormones and nutritional management in order to get our those ewes to breed relatively early. As a result of that, what we have in this table is really a current scenario and what we think are achievable goals and what producers who are following the findings of those studies are actually achieving. So in the current scenario, we have age at first lambing at 2 years, longevity about 6 years, the lambing per lifetime at 5, the frequency of lambing about 1, proportion lambing, etc. But the big figure is really the lifetime production of the animal. Just 5 or 5.5 lambs per ewe. If you implement the sort of management strategies that we have worked out, utilizing research, this jumps up to about 7.5, representing about a 35 to 40% increase in production due to productivity. So we're not increasing animal numbers, we're just getting the same ewes to produce more lambs for us. A few closing slides. Concerns relative to research and development in small island developing states. We need to be careful about the cost-benefit ratio, and we need to take into consideration how do we maximize our research efforts, considering that we have 2 universities, we have, I don't know, at least 4 or 5 different, maybe about 3 or 4 different research stations. All of these have to be staffed. All of these probably have insufficient animal numbers to do meaningful research, okay? So the cost-benefit ratio needs to be considered. It's an investment, and so if we have invested, and we have invested significantly over the last 50 years, then we need to ask the questions, how has production and productivity changed? Can we identify an animal or a line of sheep or a line of goat that we can refer to and say, okay, this line is relatively productive? Can we clearly identify some feeding programs or feeding strategies to address the problems that we are having now in the dry season. All right? Our wonderful water buffalo, can we identify lines of animals that have specific characteristics? Do we know the growth rates of these animals? Can we clearly identify milk yield or milk production in these animals? These are very basic questions. And if people have done these studies, they need to publish them. And if these studies have not been done, it's things that I think we need to start to look at. We need to look at the impact on producers. And I have a story of JY1 and JY2. I wouldn't say his name, but this is a very good colleague of mine, extremely brilliant scientist, molecular geneticist. And what he did is he has spent the last 10 years looking at novel genes in the oocyte, right? In the egg of cattle and sheep and goats and that. And you've discovered a number of novel genes. Together, he probably has spent over the last 10 years, without exaggeration, probably close to $4 or $5 million. He's published well, and that's US dollars, by the way. He's published well, he's graduated a lot of students. But we have not determined a real function for any one of those genes as yet. Okay? So we have invested $4 or $5 million. Is that the kind of research we can afford to do? I suggest probably not. It's good research, but at this point in time, we probably cannot invest in that type of research. Okay, and the JY1 is for his name. So if you look it up in the, do a PubMed search and you look up JY1 or something, you would see the author and you would see why they call it JY1. Okay, direction of research and development. So we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Are we addressing the important issues? Are we addressing the issues in the right order? High-tech management strategies, is that what we are going after, or high-tech facilities? In some cases, high-tech facilities can bail us out. But in general, if you have poor management, you can get the best high-tech facility. You could bring in tunnel ventilated houses and stuff, and that is not going to solve the problem of poor management. Do we have, and this is the one I get in trouble with all the time, do we have the human resource capacity to drive research and development in the livestock sector? And we need to be honest about that question. And when I say that, you think about our research stations, for example. I wouldn't use universities, but I would use our research stations. So the USDA research stations, as Dr. Bridge-Mohan always points out, because he has had the opportunity to work on some of these research stations, is going to be filled with scientists with years and years experience, all PhDs. It's going to be filled with postdocs, and it's going to be filled with graduate students who are doing their research in that particular area. All right? That's somewhat different to the situation that we have here. And so, where we have a limited number of scientists, is there a mechanism? Because at the end of the day, most of these institutions are really spending the public dollar. Even though they are different locations, but they're probably spending the public dollar. And so we need to make a decision of what approach that we need to take in order to conduct research, effective research. I would like to conclude by suggesting that I think we can meet this challenge. I think we have no choice but to try to meet this challenge of increasing our protein supply and increasing it efficiently. The other thing that I need to suggest is, or I want to suggest, is that we need to establish a clear research agenda, if I can use the term used by Dr. Bridge-Mohan. We need to know where we are going. What are some of the things that we are targeting, okay? And in so doing, whatever we decide upon, there's probably room for everyone. There's room for the animal scientists and the practitioner, the person who is producing. There's room for the veterinarians, the crop scientists who need to work on our feeding sources, the biotechnologists who can work directly with the animals or the feed sources. And the other thing I would like to leave with is that the information that we may require, the research questions that we may actually have to answer at this point in time, is probably very basic, but very important. And those answers to those questions can be very impactful. And not only that, since it's not out there, the information is not out there, it can also be publishable. So you don't have to fear about the promotion and tenure that might be associated with academia. Okay, just want to end, because I didn't say anything about what my research, well, I gave a brief hint about some of the things that I'm working on, but not the total picture. So for example, I didn't mention much about what Adam Redhead, he's a Trinidadian student. He's completing his PhD with me. Adam is working on a biomarker for reproductive performance. He's looking at something called anti-Müllerian hormone and whether or not that influences things like the ovulation rate in response to superovulation protocols, as well as fertility in lambs and cattle. Kelly D'Souza, she finished her master's. She did some of the work on seasonal breeding with dry ewes. Kelly decided that she didn't want to work with animals after she graduated. So that's the summer after she graduated, she took a job in a human fertility clinic, and now she's a trained andrologist, making more money than I. So it shows that working with livestock does offer the other opportunities. Carly just completed her master's last year, and she's now doing her vet degree at Michigan State University. Erin has decided she wants to be a AmeriCorps Vista. She would be finishing up this summer. Abby finished up in December. He's from Nigeria. He did the work looking at the combination of nutrition and hormonal treatments on rebreeding of animals. We was trying to make sure Abby graduated in December, because sometime earlier last year he told me that his parents would like to come across from Nigeria to see him graduate, and they will be coming in Nigeria. And then in about September, Abby said, well, change in plans. He's going into the US Army after he graduated because he wanted to go into medical school, and that's the only way he could pay for it. So Abby, the last time I heard from Abby, he was in Oklahoma in basic training. Not shown here my recent graduate students. We have two Ashleys. One is looking at fatty acid metabolites and the influence on fertility. The other Ashley is looking at different levels of progesterone on fertility. And Kyle, again, not featured here, he's probably not going to finish, and he's probably going to go into medical school because grad school is a little bit tough for him. So that's the people who I've been working with and have been generating some of this research, in addition to the folks, Reza and Mr. Su, that I work with here. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and would be willing to answer any questions.